Silverbow County, Montana Territory. The 9th of November, 1886. The autumn had been a liar. It had dressed itself in warm Chinook winds and a sky so blue it looked painted, whispering that winter might show mercy this year, that the cold might come gently. For Maren Dolby, standing in the doorway of a house that was no longer hers, the lie was over. The truth stood before her in the shape of a man with a leather satchel and a piece of paper that smelled of courthouse ink. His name was Garrett Croft. He was the regional land agent for the Anaconda Company, a tall man with a carefully trimmed mustache and boots that were always clean, even in mud season. He did not enjoy this part of his work. That much was visible in the way he held the foreclosure notice away from his body, like a dead thing he had been forced to carry. Mrs. Dolby, the company extended the grace period twice already, he said, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man who had rehearsed his kindness. Your husband's accident voided the mineral lease. Without an active claim holder, the dwelling reverts. You understand? She understood. Her husband, Eric, had been dead 41 days. A Polish salt miner's son from Wielice, who had followed the copper west. He had fallen not in some dramatic cave collapse, but from a simple ladder in the Neversweet mine shaft. A rung broke. His boot slipped 12 feet onto wet rock. He lingered for 6 days with a cracked skull, speaking to people who were not in the room, calling for his mother in a language Maren did not share. Then he stopped. The wagon to Butte runs Thursday, Croft continued. He would not look at her face. He looked instead at the door frame, at the place where Eric had carved a small cross into the wood the day they moved in. There are boarding houses there. Places for women in your situation. Your situation. The phrase was a coffin built from 2 words. I have until when? Maren said. It was not a question. She already knew. Sunset today. I am sorry for it. He was sorry. She believed him. But sorry was a wind that blew through you and left nothing behind. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 company men she did not recognize carried her belongings out through the front door and set them in the frozen mud of the yard. A cook stove, too heavy for her to move alone. A pine trunk that held her clothes and Eric's. A bedroll. A canvas sack of tools that had been Eric's father's before him and now belonged to no one the company recognized. The men worked without malice. One of them placed her kettle upright on the trunk rather than letting it fall, a small gesture of decency that somehow made the whole thing worse. The town of Garnet watched. It was a mining settlement of perhaps 300 souls clinging to the side of a mountain that was slowly being eaten from the inside out. The people were not evil. They were cold and they were afraid, and they were already calculating how much firewood they would need to survive what the old-timers were calling the worst early freeze in memory. Pity flickered in the windows of the houses along the main street, but it was quickly chased away by the mathematics of scarcity. Maren Dolby was an outsider twice over. She was a widow, which made her a burden. And she was Danish, the daughter of a Copenhagen potter who had filled her childhood with the smell of wet clay and the low heat of a kiln, which made her strange. Her English carried the ghost of another tongue. Her habits were foreign. She boiled water when everyone else drank it cold. She touched soil the way other women touched fabric, testing its texture between her fingers as though it were telling her something. The wives of Garnet had tolerated her when she had a husband to make her legible. Without him, she was simply a foreign woman with dirt under her nails and no claim to anything. She did not beg. She did not knock on a single door. She had watched the town long enough to know that charity here was a transaction, and she had nothing left to trade. As the sun dropped behind the ridge and the temperature fell like a stone into a well, Maren sat on her trunk in the yard of a house that had been hers that morning. She could feel the cold, finding the gaps in her coat, pressing against her ribs like fingers searching for a heartbeat to stop. The first hard frost was already forming on the mud, turning into iron. By morning, the ground would be locked shut until April. She closed her eyes and let the cold press in, and in that darkness she heard Eric's voice. Not the broken voice of his last days, but the voice from before, the one that smelled of copper dust and black tea. He was sitting across from her in the kitchen that was no longer hers. turning a piece of chalky mineralite over in his hands the way his father had taught him, reading the stone like a letter from the earth. "You Americans," he had said, though he included himself in the accusation with a half-smile. "You build on the surface and then you are surprised when the surface betrays you. My father worked the salt mines in Wieliczka, 300 meters below the ground, Marin. And you know what it was, down there? It was warm, always warm. Not from fire, from the earth itself. The deeper you go, the more the earth holds its heat. The surface is a fool. Everything real is underneath." She had laughed at him then. She was not laughing now. She opened her eyes. The sky was the color of a bruise turning black. She needed to move or she would freeze here on this trunk, and they would find her in the morning, stiff as furniture. She looked south, toward the old rail spur that the company had abandoned 2 years ago when the main line shifted. The tracks ran along a cut in the hillside where a seasonal creek had been diverted during construction. She had walked there with Eric once in August, picking service berries, and he had stopped and stared at the cut bank for a long time, pressing his palm flat against the exposed earth. "Feel that," he had said. She had touched the bank. It was cool. In August, with the sun directly overhead and the air thick with heat and grasshoppers, the earth beneath the rail cut was cool and slightly damp. "Thermal mass," Eric had said, using the term his father had taught him. This much earth holds its temperature. In every competition, a smile can be your secret strength. Not hot, but warm enough. The salt miners knew this. The Roman engineers knew this. Everyone forgot. Everyone forgot. But Marin had not forgotten. She stood up from the trunk. She could not carry the stove. She took the bedroll, the canvas sack of tools, a cast iron pot, a sack of oats, and Eric's small leather notebook, the one he had kept since his apprentice days in the mines, filled with diagrams and measurements and notes in a cramped mix of Polish and English that she had slowly learned to read. She rolled everything into the bedroll and strapped it to her back. She left the rest. She would come back for it if she survived. If she did not, it would not matter. The walk to the rail spur was 1.25 miles along a path she could barely see. The wind had picked up, carrying a fine, gritty snow that stung her face like thrown sand. Her boots broke through the early crusts of frost with each step, the sound sharp and small against the enormous silence of the darkening mountains. She kept her eyes on the ground and counted her steps, and when she lost count, she started again from 1. The rail spur emerged from the darkness like the spine of some buried animal. The tracks were already half covered in snow and dead grass. She followed them south to where the cut deepened, the hillside rising on her left to a height of perhaps 10 feet, exposing a wall of packed earth and embedded river rock. This was where Eric had pressed his palm. She pressed her own palm against it now, through her mitten. She could not feel the temperature through the wool, so she pulled the mitten off with her teeth and laid her bare hand flat on the exposed earth. It was not warm, but it was not the killing cold of the open air either. It was the temperature of a root cellar, perhaps 40 degrees. In the open, the air was already below zero and falling. She had found her wall. Now she needed to go into it. She worked through the night. Using a short-handled pickaxe from Eric's kit, she struck the earth at the base of the cut, where the soil was loosest, where the creek had once softened the ground before being diverted. The frozen surface layer was brutal, 3 inches of iron that threw sparks off the pick. But beneath it, the earth yielded. It was dense clay mixed with gravel, the kind of soil her father would have recognized instantly, the kind he had used to build his kilns in Copenhagen. Clay holds heat the way a sponge holds water. Her father had told her that when she was 9 years old, standing beside him as he packed clay around the fire chamber of a new kiln. Fire is a wild animal, Marin. Clay is the cage that teaches it to be useful. By the time a gray and reluctant dawn broke over the mountains, she had excavated a cavity roughly 4 feet deep, 5 feet wide, and tall enough to sit up in. The opening faced south, away from the prevailing north wind. The sides were solid clay. The temperature inside, even without fire, was noticeably different from the air outside. Her hands were raw, bleeding at the knuckles where the pick handle had worn through her skin. She did not care. She was alive. Over the next 2 weeks, Maren dug. She followed the principles Eric had sketched in his notebook, the ones his father had passed down from the salt mines, cross-referencing them with what her own father had taught her about clay and thermal retention. She expanded the cavity into a proper chamber, 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with a curved ceiling that she shaped by hand, smoothing the clay with the back of a spoon until it was nearly as even as a potter's bowl. The curve was important. Her father had explained that a dome ceiling distributes the weight of the earth above and also circulates warm air in a slow, continuous loop, preventing the heat from pooling and escaping to a single point. She dug a ventilation shaft, a narrow channel angled upward through the hillside to the surface, using a technique Eric had described in a sketch labeled Polish mine air. The shaft was only 4 inches across, too small to lose significant heat, but enough to draw fresh air in and push stale air out. She plugged the surface opening with a loose bundle of dried grass that could be adjusted for airflow. She lined the floor with flat stones from the creek bed, fitting them together like puzzle pieces, and layered dried pine needles over them for insulation. She packed the walls with an additional layer of clay mixed with dried grass, a technique her father had called poor man's brick. When it dried, it was nearly as hard as fired ceramic and held heat with the same stubborn patience. For the fire, she built a small hearth at the back of the chamber, no larger than a dinner plate, with a channel cut into the clay wall behind it that rose at an angle toward the surface. This was the flue, but it was also something more. The channel was lined with the densest clay she could find, packed thick around its entire length. When she burned a small fire, the smoke rose through the channel and exited, but the heat from the smoke was absorbed by the surrounding clay. The clay became a reservoir. Hours after the fire died, the walls were still warm to the touch. She discovered the hot spring by accident. On her 8th day of digging, expanding a storage alcove to the right of the main chamber, her pick broke through into a pocket of gravel that was wet and, impossibly, warm. Not hot, not steaming, but warm, perhaps 60 degrees. A gentle, constant warmth rising from somewhere deep below. She stared at the dark, wet gravel and remembered Eric's voice. The deeper you go, the more the earth holds its heat. She had not gone deep, but something deep had come up to her. A seep of geothermally warmed water, rising through the fractured rock beneath the old creek bed. She did not try to understand the geology. She simply channeled the seep into a shallow clay basin she shaped in the floor, a basin that radiated low, constant heat into the chamber, like a second hearth that never needed fuel. By the end of November, her shelter was complete. From the outside, it was nearly invisible, just a low, dark opening in the cut bank beneath the abandoned rail tracks, obscured by a door she had fashioned from salvaged railroad ties and packed earth. The interior was dry, dim, and warm. The temperature held steady near 55 degrees, even when the outside air plunged to 30 below. She burned small fires of deadfall pine and serviceberry wood, never more than a double handful at a time, just enough to raise the chamber temperature to 65 or 70 and recharge the clay walls. The smoke that left her flue was thin, nearly invisible, dispersed by the time it cleared the top of the hill. She had not built a cabin. She had grown a den. She had burrowed into the body of the earth and asked it to keep her alive, and the earth had said yes. Garrett Croft was the first to call her mad. He had ridden past the rail spur on company business in early December and spotted her footprints in the snow. He followed them and found the entrance, and he stood outside it with a look on his face that was equal parts bewilderment and distaste. "Mrs. Dalby," he called into the darkness, "this is not habitation. This is a hole in the ground." She appeared in the entrance, her face calm, her hands covered in dried clay. "It is warm, Mr. Croft." "It is a grave," he said. "You are living like an animal. When the spring melt comes, this whole bank will slide and bury you. I have seen it happen." She said nothing. She had calculated the slope. She had studied the way the water moved. She had read Eric's notes on load-bearing earth. But she did not argue. She had learned that arguing with men who had already decided you were mad was like arguing with the wind. The word spread through Garnet the way gossip does in small places, fast and gaining cruelty with each retelling. The Danish widow had dug herself into the hillside like a badger. She was living in the dirt under the old tracks. She had lost her mind with grief. Silas Hargrove, who ran the general store, said it plainly over his counter to anyone who would listen. She is digging her own grave, and she does not know it. But Silas Hargrove had a moment he did not share with anyone. It was early December, a week after the first deep snow. He had taken his youngest daughter, Annie, to the creek to check the traps, and the child had slipped on ice and gashed her knee badly. Annie was screaming, blood soaking through her woolen stockings, and they were closer to the rail spur than to town. Silas carried the girl toward the only shelter he knew of, cursing himself for it, and Marin Dalby appeared in the entrance of her earthen den before he even called out. She brought them inside. She cleaned the wound with warm water from the clay basin, water that should not have been warm but was. She bound it with clean linen she had boiled. She gave Annie a cup of oat porridge sweetened with the last of her own honey. Annie stopped crying within minutes, calmed by the warmth and the steady quiet of the underground chamber. Silas sat in that den and felt the temperature on his skin and looked at the smooth clay walls and the tiny, efficient fire and the impossible warmth rising from the floor, and he did not understand any of it. He thanked her stiffly when they left. He did not tell anyone in town what he had seen. He went back to his counter and said nothing, but he stopped calling her mad after that. He simply stopped talking about her at all. December came not as a visitor, but as a verdict. The blizzard that struck on the 17th was the worst in living memory. It lasted 4 days. The temperature dropped to 42 below zero. The wind drove snow horizontally, packing it against walls and doors with the force of masonry. In Garnet, the effects were catastrophic. Firewood, which the townspeople had stacked in what they considered generous quantities, was consumed at triple the normal rate. The cold found every gap, every poorly chinked joint, every thin spot in every cabin wall. Fires that normally heated a room could not keep pace with the heat bleeding out through the timber. The wood was losing the war. On the second day, the supply road to Butte was buried under 8 feet of snow. On the third day, 2 cabins on the north end of town lost their roofs to the weight. 3 children and an elderly man moved into the church, where the massive iron stove burned day and night, consuming firewood at a rate that made the deacon weep. By the 4th day, there were frostbite cases. The doctor's own surgery was barely above freezing. Marin Dalby, in her hole in the ground, was warm. She sat in her chamber by the light of a single tallow candle, reading Eric's notebook. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth and clay held steady. The geothermal seep continued its quiet, patient work. She burned 1 small fire in the morning and 1 at night, using less wood in a day than most cabins in Garnet used in an hour. The blizzard was a sound, a distant roaring above her head, muffled by 3 feet of earth in the frozen rail bed. In every competition, a smile can be your secret strength. She had dug at the precise angle Eric's notes specified. She was not merely surviving, she was comfortable. She was reading by candlelight in a room that smelled of warm clay and pine needles, while the worst storm in a generation tried to murder everything above ground. When the blizzard finally broke on the 21st, Garnet emerged into a world transformed. Snowdrifts reached the eaves of some buildings. The temperature remained brutal. The firewood situation was now critical. 3 families had already burned furniture. Garrett Croft came to the rail spur on the 23rd of December. He came alone, on foot, through waist-deep snow. His face was raw and red, his mustache crusted with ice. He stood at the entrance of Marin's shelter, and he did not call out. He simply stood there, breathing hard, his leather satchel hanging limp and empty at his side. He looked smaller than she remembered. Marin opened the door of packed earth and railroad ties. Warm air spilled out around her into the frozen morning, and she watched his face change. The certainty that had been the architecture of his expression the professional confidence, the institutional authority, all of it fell away like plaster from a crumbling wall. What remained was a man who was cold and afraid, and standing at the edge of something he did not understand. "I wrote the notice that put you out," he said. His voice cracked on the word notice. "I know that." She waited. "There are children in the church. The stove cannot keep up. The deacon says they have wood for 4 more days, maybe 5. After that," he stopped. He looked at the dark opening behind her, at the warmth that should not have existed. How is this possible? Maren stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "I will show you." He ducked through the entrance and straightened up inside the chamber. The warmth folded around him like water. He stood absolutely still for a long moment, his cracked hands held out at his sides, palms open, feeling the heat radiating from the clay walls. He turned slowly, taking in the smooth curved ceiling, the tiny hearth, the clay-lined flue, the shallow basin in the floor where warm water caught the light of the candle. "The earth holds it," Maren said simply. "My husband's father knew this from the salt mines. My own father knew it from building kilns. The clay absorbs the heat and gives it back slowly. The water beneath us has been warm since before any of us were born. I did not create any of this. I only listened to what was already here." Croft pressed his bare palm against the wall. It was warm. Not hot. Warm. The steady, patient warmth of something that did not need to be fed or maintained. That simply was. He kept his hand there for a long time. "Can this be done for the church?" he asked quietly. "Not in the same way. But the principles, yes. Earth berms against the walls. Clay packed around the stovepipe to hold the heat instead of losing it to the roof. Smaller chambers inside larger rooms, blankets hung to trap warmth close. The idea is the same. Stop fighting the cold. In every competition, a smile can be your secret strength." Croft nodded. He pulled his hand from the wall and looked at her, and whatever he was going to say caught in his throat. He looked away. He put his glove back on with slow, deliberate care. "I will bring people," he said. "Bring them," she said. They came on Christmas Eve. The deacon came first, then Silas Hargrove with his daughter Annie, who ran to Maren and hugged her around the waist without hesitation. Then Croft returned with the doctor and 2 miners and their wives. Maren showed them everything. She showed them the clay walls and explained how thermal mass worked, using the same words Eric had used, the same words his father had used in the salt mines. She showed them the flue and the way the heat was captured. She showed them the geothermal seep and washed their faces as they touched the warm water. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind them of the foreclosure notice or the yard where her belongings had been set in the mud. She simply taught. She drew diagrams in the clay floor with a stick, and Croft copied them into his leather satchel notebook, and the miners asked questions in the careful, respectful way that working men ask questions when they recognize real knowledge. Within a week, Garnet was transformed. Earth and snow berms appeared against the north walls of every cabin. Clay-packed chimneys replaced open flues. The church installed a clay and stone heat bank behind its iron stove that kept the building warm for hours after the fire burned down. Wood consumption dropped by more than half. No one froze, no one died. The town that had set her belongings in the mud survived because of the knowledge they had dismissed as quaint. By March, when the first melt loosened the grip of ice in the mountains and the supply road opened again, travelers coming into Garnet noticed something unusual. The buildings had an odd look to them. Heavy earthen banks built up against their foundations, thick clay collars around their chimneys. They looked almost buried, almost grown from the hillside rather than built upon it. The travelers asked questions, and the people of Garnet pointed south, toward the rail spur, toward the woman who lived in the earth. On the first truly warm day of April, Maren sat outside her shelter on a flat stone, her face turned up to the sun. Eric's notebook was open on her knee, its pages softened by months of handling. She was not reading it. She was holding it the way you hold something that has finished its work and can finally rest. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the still bare serviceberry canes. The abandoned tracks beside her were beginning to rust in the new moisture. Below her, in the town, she could hear the sound of hammers, a dozen of them, as the people of Garnet rebuilt their homes with the principles she had taught them. Principles that had traveled from a salt mine in Poland through a potter's workshop in Copenhagen through a dead man's notebook to this hillside in Montana where a woman had refused to die. She closed the notebook. She pressed it flat against her chest with both palms. The meadowlark sang again. She listened. Now I want to talk directly to you. The person listening to this, right now. Maren Dalby was not a genius. She was not gifted with unusual strength or extraordinary luck. She was a woman who had been thrown out into the cold with nothing but a dead man's notebook and a memory of her father's hands shaping clay. She survived because she remembered what everyone else had forgotten, that the earth itself is a furnace if you know how to ask it for warmth. And here's the question I need you to sit with. What knowledge have you inherited that you have been told is useless? What lesson from a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a friend who is no longer here have you folded up and put away because the world around you said it was outdated, impractical, or strange? What wall of packed earth are you walking past every single day without pressing your palm against it? The world will tell you the way forward is the way everyone else is going. Build higher, burn more, fight harder. And when the blizzard comes, as it always does, you will find yourself shivering in a well-built cabin that is losing heat faster than you can feed it. Or you can dig. You can go into the thing that looks like a grave and discover that it is a fortress. You can take the old knowledge, the dismissed knowledge, the inherited knowledge, and you can press your hand against the wall and feel the warmth that has been there all along. Your cut bank is waiting. Your clay is waiting. The notebook is already in your hands. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival and shelter. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.